Comrades, you have been taught to believe that the world as it exists is the only world possible. You are told that inequality is natural, that exploitation is inevitable, that poverty is the fault of the poor and wealth the reward of virtue. You are told to lower your eyes, tighten your belts, and accept a system that devours your labor, while offering you survival as a privilege. But I tell you this, the greatest lie ever sold to humanity is that the present order is eternal. Look more closely. Beneath the polished surface of this decaying system, beneath its markets, its profits, and its false promises, a new world is already taking shape. It is growing silently in the cracks of the old one, where cooperation resists competition, where solidarity defies greed, where human need challenges the tyranny of profit. History is not moved by ideas floating in the air, but by material force, by the clash between classes whose interests are irreconcilable. Every society has been built upon this struggle. Today, as yesterday, we stand divided into two great camps, those who own the means of production, and those who own nothing but their labor power. One class lives by appropriating the labor of others. The other survives by selling its time, its strength, its very life. Capitalism presents itself as freedom, yet it chains the worker to wages that barely sustain existence. It boasts of progress, yet produces abundance for a few and misery for the many. It praises individuality, yet reduces human beings to replaceable parts of a machine. The worker becomes an appendage of capital, valued not for their humanity, but for their productivity, discarded when profit demands it. This is not an accident. This is not a moral failure of individual capitalists. It is the logic of the system itself. Capital must grow, or it dies. To grow, it must extract more labor, cheapen life, and concentrate wealth. Thus, poverty expands alongside riches, and crisis follows crisis like a shadow that cannot be escaped. Yet capitalism carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. In its relentless pursuit of profit, it creates the very force that will overthrow it. It gathers workers into factories, offices, and digital platforms. It binds them together through shared exploitation, and in doing so, it creates not only misery but consciousness. Class consciousness is the moment when the worker recognizes that their suffering is not personal but collective, when they see that their enemy is not the worker beside them but the system above them, when they understand that their power lies not in isolated survival but in organized unity. The ruling class fears this awakening more than any economic crisis, for machines can be replaced, markets manipulated, and laws rewritten, but a united working class cannot be easily silenced. That is why they divide you by race, by nation, by religion, by gender. That is why they turn worker against worker, neighbor against neighbor, while they continue to rule unquestioned. But comrades, the illusion is breaking. Across the world, people are beginning to see through the spectacle. They see that endless growth on a finite planet is madness. They see that democracy without economic power is hollow. They see that a system that prioritizes profit over life has forfeited its right to exist. And so, in the margins, alternatives are emerging. Workers organize cooperatives, communities reclaim resources, movements rise demanding dignity, not charity. These are not utopian fantasies, they are material responses to material conditions. They are the early forms of a society struggling to be born. Do not underestimate these cracks in the old order. Every dominant system once appeared invincible until the moment it collapsed. Feudalism fell when its relations of production could no longer contain the forces it unleashed. Capitalism will fall for the same reason. Its contradictions are sharpening, its crisis deepening, its legitimacy eroding. The task before you is not to beg for reforms that leave the foundation intact, but to transform the foundation itself. Not to humanize exploitation, but to abolish it. Not to ask for a larger share of the chains, but to break them entirely. This transformation will not be granted from above. No ruling class has ever surrendered power willingly. It must be seized through organization, struggle, and solidarity. The working class must become not only a class in itself, but a class for itself aware, disciplined, and resolute. You are told to be patient, but hunger cannot wait. You are told to be realistic, but realism under oppression is merely submission. The true realism is recognizing that a system built on exploitation cannot produce justice, and that those who create the world have the power to recreate it. The world you dream of, a world without exploitation, without domination, without the alienation of labor, is not a distant horizon. It is already being built wherever people refuse to accept the logic of capital as the logic of life. History is calling you, not as individuals seeking personal escape, but as a class capable of collective liberation. The future does not belong to those who own the most, but to those who produce everything. Workers of the world, recognize yourselves. Organize. Unite. The old world is cracking, and the new one is already pushing through. Capitalism survives not because it delivers justice or freedom, but because it trains society to accept exploitation and inequality as normal, inevitable, and even desirable. From the earliest moments of socialization, individuals are taught that hierarchy is natural, that some must command while others obey, that wealth accumulates upward because talent and effort flow in that direction. This narrative conceals the material reality that capitalism is not a neutral system of exchange, but a social relation built on the systematic extraction of surplus value from the laboring majority by a property-owning minority. Exploitation under capitalism is rendered invisible by the wage form. The worker appears to be paid fairly for their labor, yet what is truly sold is not labor itself, but labor, power, the capacity to work for a period of time. During that time, the worker produces value beyond what is returned to them in wages. This unpaid labor is the source of profit, but capitalism masks the theft by presenting the wage as a fair exchange between equals. The worker leaves the workplace exhausted, having generated wealth they will never control. Why? The capitalist claims profit as a legitimate reward for ownership rather than appropriation. Inequality is not a malfunction of capitalism. It is its lifeblood. The system requires a permanent division between those who own the means of production and those who do not. If workers were not compelled by necessity to sell their labor, capital would lose its power. Thus, poverty must exist alongside abundance. Unemployment must persist to discipline wages. Insecurity must be widespread to ensure compliance. Capitalism does not merely tolerate inequality, it reproduces it daily through its structures, laws, and institutions. To maintain its legitimacy, capitalism transforms exploitation into personal failure and inequality into individual destiny. The poor are told they lack discipline, ambition, or intelligence. The rich are praised as innovators and risk-takers, despite deriving their wealth from inherited property, monopolies, or the collective labor of others. Structural violence is reframed as moral deficiency, and social outcomes are presented as the result of private choices rather than material conditions. In this way, the system absolves itself while placing blame on its victims. The normalization of exploitation is reinforced through ideology. Media celebrates wealth while obscuring labor. Education prepares individuals to compete, not to cooperate. Politics offers symbolic participation, while economic power remains untouched. Even resistance is often absorbed, commodified, and sold back as lifestyle or branding. Capitalism excels at turning human suffering into spectacle and dissent into market opportunity, ensuring that outrage rarely translates into organized challenge. Alienation is one of capitalism's most effective tools. Workers are separated from the products of their labor, from the process of production, from their fellow workers, and ultimately from their own human potential. Work becomes a means of survival rather than self-expression, and life is reduced to cycles of exhaustion and consumption. This fragmentation weakens solidarity and makes collective resistance more difficult, as individuals are encouraged to view themselves as isolated competitors rather than members of a shared class with common interests. Global capitalism extends this normalization on an international scale. Entire regions are reduced to sources of cheap labor and raw materials, while wealth concentrates in imperial centers. Exploitation across borders is justified through narratives of development and modernization, even as workers in both the global South and North experience declining conditions. Capital flows freely, labor is disciplined by borders, and inequality becomes embedded in the global order as a permanent feature rather than a historical injustice. Crises expose the truth of the system, yet even these moments are normalized. Economic collapses, environmental devastation, and social breakdown are treated as unavoidable cycles rather than consequences of a profit-driven system. Workers are asked to sacrifice during downturns, while capital is rescued and restored. Each crisis deepens inequality, concentrates ownership, and reinforces the idea that there is no alternative, even as living conditions deteriorate for the majority. Capitalism survives because it convinces people that exploitation is simply how the world works, that inequality is unfortunate, but natural, and that resistance is futile or dangerous. By embedding its logic into everyday life, it transforms domination into common sense and submission into responsibility. As long as exploitation is seen as normal, the system can continue extracting value from human lives while presenting itself as the only rational order, even as the contradictions sharpen. Living labor is devalued, social bonds erode, and the gap between those who produce and those who own continues to widen without interruption. Resistance simmering beneath the surface, where workers begin to recognize that what they endure is not personal misfortune but a shared condition, imposed by a system that depends on their continued dispossession. Class struggle is the engine through which history moves, the hidden force beneath political events, cultural shifts, and economic transformation. Human societies do not evolve through harmony or moral progress alone, but through conflict between groups whose material interests are opposed. At every stage of development, the way a society produces and distributes its material wealth shapes social relations. And from these relations emerge classes locked in struggle over power, resources, and control of labor. In ancient societies, this struggle took the form of conflicts between slave and master, where one class lived entirely from the coerced labor of another. In feudal systems, history advanced through the tension between lord and serf, with land ownership granting political authority and economic dominance. These systems did not collapse because rulers became unjust or inefficient, but because their internal contradiction reached a point where existing relations of production could no longer contain the productive forces they had created. New classes emerged within the old order, challenging it from within until transformation became unavoidable. Capitalism represents a new stage in this historical process, but it does not escape the logic of class antagonism. It replaces feudal privilege with private ownership of the means of production and transforms labor into a commodity. Society becomes polarized into two primary classes: the bourgeoisie, who own capital, and the proletariat, who own nothing but their labor power. The apparent freedom of the market conceals a relationship of domination, as workers must sell their labor to survive while capital accumulates through the unpaid labor embedded in every commodity. The struggle between these classes is not always visible in open confrontation. Often it unfolds through legislation, workplace discipline, cultural norms, and ideological narratives that present existing power relations as neutral or inevitable. Wages, working hours, job security, and access to social resources become sites of constant conflict, even when framed as technical or administrative issues. Every concession won by workers has historically been the result of struggle, not generosity, and every right exists only so long as it is defended. Class struggle also shapes political institutions. The state does not stand above society as a neutral arbiter, but arises from and serves the interests of the dominant class. Laws, policing, and governance reflect the needs of capital, ensuring stable conditions for accumulation while managing the unrest produced by exploitation. Even democratic forms are constrained by economic power, as those who control production wield disproportionate influence over political life. When the working class organizes independently, the state responds not with neutrality, but with repression, co-optation, or reform designed to preserve the underlying system. Ideology plays a central role in mediating class struggle. The ruling class's ideas become the ruling ideas of society, shaping how people understand work, success, and failure. Individual achievement is emphasized while collective conditions are obscured. Social problems are personalized, and systemic exploitation is reframed as personal responsibility. This ideological domination weakens class consciousness and fragments resistance, making exploitation appear natural rather than historical. Yet class struggle cannot be permanently suppressed. because it is rooted in material conditions. As capitalism expands, it deepens the very contradictions that generate resistance. Productivity increases, yet wages stagnate. Wealth concentrates, while insecurity spreads. Workers are drawn together in large-scale production and global supply chain, creating shared experiences of exploitation across industries and borders. These conditions lay the groundwork for collective awareness as individuals begin to recognize that their hardships are not isolated but systemic. Moments of crisis intensify class struggle by stripping away illusion. Economic downturns, wars, and social upheavals expose the priorities of the system, revealing whose lives are protected and whose are sacrificed. In these moments, the working class is often asked to bear the cost of failures it did not create, while capital is shielded from loss. Such contradictions sharpen antagonisms and open space for new forms of organization and resistance. Historical change occurs when class struggle reaches a point where existing social relations can no longer reproduce themselves. The ruling class loses its ability to govern in the old way, and the oppressed refuse to live in the old way. Transformation becomes possible when the working class moves from spontaneous resistance to conscious organization, from reacting to exploitation to challenging the system that produces it. This transition is not automatic, but requires political clarity, solidarity, and sustained struggle. The direction of historical change is not predetermined, but shaped by the outcome of these conflicts. Progress does not emerge from consensus, but from confrontation between opposing interests. Every advance in human freedom has been born from struggle. Every ruling class has been forced to yield, only when its dominance was challenged collectively. Class struggle is not a relic of the past, but an ongoing process embedded in the structures of modern society, driving history forward through tension, resistance, and the continual reorganization of social life as long as exploitation remains the foundation of production. Workers' unity represents the most profound danger to ruling power, because it strikes at the foundation upon which domination rests. The authority of the ruling class does not depend solely on wealth or force, but on the fragmentation of those who produce that wealth. Capital rules not simply because it owns factories, land, and machines, but because workers confront this power as isolated individuals rather than as a collective force conscious of its own strength. Disunity is the invisible pillar of domination, and unity is the force that can bring it down. The ruling class understands that its power is not absolute. A single worker is replaceable, but workers acting together are not. Every industry, every service, every system that sustains society depends on the coordinated labor of millions. When this labor is withdrawn, slowed, or redirected, the illusion of ruling class omnipotence collapses. Profit ceases to flow, authority falters, and the dependency of capital on labor is exposed. Unity transforms labor from a passive resource into an active weapon, capable of disrupting the normal functioning of the system. This is why capitalism invests enormous energy in dividing workers. Differences of nationality, race, religion, gender, language, and legal status are exaggerated and weaponized to prevent solidarity. Workers are encouraged to see one another as competitors rather than allies, threats rather than comrades. Migrant labor is blamed for low wages, marginalized groups are scapegoated for social decline, and cultural conflicts are amplified to obscure the common material condition of exploitation. As long as workers fight one another, the ruling class remains secure. Unity threatens not only economic power, but ideological control. When workers organize collectively, they begin to see beyond the narratives imposed upon them. Individual failure is revealed as structural injustice. Meritocracy is exposed as myth. The idea that wealth reflects moral superiority collapses when workers recognize that they collectively create all value while owning none of it. This shared understanding undermines the legitimacy of ruling power, replacing resignation with awareness and obedience with resistance. Historically, every significant gain made by working people has been the result of unity. Shorter working hours, safer conditions, living wages, and social protections were not gifts from benevolent rulers, but concessions forced through collective struggle. Each victory demonstrated that power is not fixed but relational, shifting when workers act together. These moments terrify the ruling class because they reveal a dangerous truth that the system survives only as long as workers consent to their own exploitation. Unity also transforms the psychological condition of the worker. Isolation breeds fear, insecurity, and submission. Collective action produces confidence, dignity, and courage. When workers stand together, fear changes sides. The threat of dismissal loses its force when resistance is collective. Repression becomes risky when opposition is widespread. Unity replaces the logic of survival with the logic of struggle, turning private despair into public action. The ruling class attempts to neutralize this threat through controlled form of organization that channel worker discontent into safe, manageable outlets. Bureaucratized unions, symbolic representation, and limited reforms are tolerated, insofar as they do not challenge the fundamental relations of production. But genuine unity, rooted in class consciousness and independent organization, exceeds these boundaries. It refuses to limit demands to what the system can easily absorb and instead questions who owns, who controls, and who benefits from social labor. Unity is dangerous because it reveals that workers do not merely suffer under the system. They are essential to it. Capital cannot function without labor, but labor can imagine a society without capital. This asymmetry terrifies the ruling class. Once workers recognize their collective power, obedience must be enforced rather than assumed. And enforcement exposes the coercive nature of the system that claims to be free. In moments of crisis, the fear of unity becomes especially visible. Strikes are criminalized, protests are surveilled, organizers are punished, and movements are fragmented through concessions or repression. These responses betray the anxiety of those in power who understand that unity is contagious and difficult to reverse once it takes root. A unified working class does not merely demand better conditions, it begins to challenge the right of the ruling class to rule at all. Workers' unity threatens ruling power because it dissolves the illusion that domination is natural and permanent. It replaces resignation with agency and competition with solidarity. It exposes that the power of the few is nothing more than the organized dependence on the many. And once that dependence is recognized and confronted collectively, the foundations of authority begin to crack, not through chaos or spontaneity, but through conscious discipline and collective action that turns the producers of society into its decision-makers. Capitalism creates the conditions for its own collapse, not through accident or moral failure, but through the internal contradictions embedded in its very structure. It is a system driven by the endless pursuit of profit, yet profit itself depends on exploited labor while simultaneously undermining the conditions that make exploitation possible. This contradiction is not external. To capitalism, it is the engine of its motion, producing growth, crisis, and instability in a continuous cycle that intensifies over time. At the heart of capitalism lies the contradiction between social production and private appropriation. Modern production is collective by nature. Millions of workers across industries and continents cooperate, directly or indirectly, to produce goods and services. Yet the wealth generated through this collective labor is privately owned and controlled by a small class of capitalists. As productivity increases, this contradiction deepens. Workers produce more than ever before, but ownership becomes more concentrated, creating a widening gap between social labor and private profit. Capitalism's drive to increase productivity accelerates this process. To remain competitive, capitalists introduce new technologies, automate labor, and reorganize production to extract greater efficiency. While these changes increase output, they also reduce the need for human labor, displacing workers and shrinking the very source of value creation. As labor is replaced or intensified, unemployment and precarity rise, wages stagnate, and the purchasing power of the working class declines. The system produces abundance, yet restricts access to it, generating crises of overproduction where goods cannot be sold despite widespread need. Economic crises are not anomalies within capitalism, but recurring expressions of its contradictions. Booms are followed by busts as speculative expansion collides with the limits of consumption. Capital accumulates beyond profitable investment opportunities, leading to financial bubbles, debt expansion, and eventual collapse. Each crisis results in massive destruction of value, livelihoods, and social social stability, while wealth and power become even more concentrated in fewer hands. The system survives by imposing the costs of its failures on the working class, deepening inequality and social resentment. Capitalism also undermines its own ideological foundations. It promises freedom, yet delivers insecurity. It claims to reward effort, yet rewards ownership. It celebrates innovation, yet stifles human potential through alienated labor. As these contradictions become more visible, belief in the system erodes. Workers are told that hard work guarantees stability, yet they experience precarious employment and declining living standards. They are promised opportunity, yet face barriers shaped by class, wealth, and inherited privilege. The gap between ideology and lived reality grows harder to conceal. Global capitalism intensifies these contradictions on a planetary scale. Capital seeks cheap labor and resources, expanding across borders while undermining local economies and social structures. Entire regions are locked into dependency, supplying raw materials and labor while wealth flows outward. Environmental destruction accelerates as nature is treated as an infinite resource to be exploited for profit. Climate crisis, ecological collapse, and resource depletion are not external threats to capitalism but consequences of its logic of endless accumulation, threatening the material conditions upon which all production depends. As capitalism expands, it also produces its own gravedigger. The working class grows in size, interconnectedness, and strategic importance. Workers are concentrated in large workplaces, global supply chains, and digital networks, creating shared experiences of exploitation across sectors and borders. While capitalism seeks to fragment and divide, the material conditions of production push workers toward collective awareness. Exploitation becomes more generalized, and resistance increasingly takes organized forms. The system's attempts to manage its contradictions through reform, regulation, or welfare measures offer temporary stabilization but cannot resolve the underlying problem. Reforms are granted only under pressure and are often rolled back when profitability is threatened. Social protections are treated as costs rather than rights, vulnerable to austerity and privatization. Each attempt to stabilize capitalism introduces new tensions, postponing collapse while increasing its eventual severity. Capitalism's dependence on perpetual growth collides with finite limits, both human and ecological. The requirement to expand profits endlessly leads to intensified exploitation, deeper inequality, and mounting social unrest. As living conditions deteriorate for the majority, consent weakens, and coercion becomes more visible. Surveillance, repression, and authoritarian measures expand to contain discontent, exposing the fragile foundations of a system that claims to rest on freedom and choice. The collapse of capitalism is not a single event, but a process shaped by struggle, crisis, and resistance. Its contradictions accumulate, its legitimacy erodes, and its capacity to reproduce stable social relations diminishes. The system continues to function only by deepening the conditions that undermine it, extracting more from labor, nature, and society, while offering diminishing returns in stability, meaning, and security, a dynamic in which the forces that sustain capitalism simultaneously generate the conditions that make its continuation increasingly untenable. Collective organization is the path to human liberation, because freedom cannot be achieved in isolation within a system structured by exploitation and domination, under conditions where social life is organized around private ownership. Profit, individuals are constrained by material forces beyond their control. The promise that personal effort alone can secure dignity and security obscures the reality that most people confront the same limits imposed by class position, regardless of talent or determination. Liberation, therefore, cannot be an individual escape from oppression, but a collective transformation of the conditions that produce it. Human beings are social by nature, yet capitalism fragments this social reality into competition and isolation. Workers are encouraged to see one another as rivals in the labor market, each struggling separately for survival. This fragmentation weakens resistance and deepens alienation, making exploitation appear as a personal burden rather than a shared condition. Collective organization reverses this process by reconnecting individuals through shared interests and common struggle. It transforms scattered experiences of injustice into a coherent understanding of systemic oppression. Through organization, workers move from being objects of history to subjects of history. Individually, workers have little power against capital, which commands resources, institutions, and political influence. Collectively, they possess immense power because they are the source of all social wealth. Organization makes this power visible and effective. It enables coordination, strategic action, and sustained resistance, allowing workers to challenge not only specific abuses but the structures that enable them. Collective organization also produces consciousness. It is through struggle that people learn the true nature of their conditions and their own capacity to change them. Meetings, debates, strikes, and campaigns become spaces where dominant ideologies are questioned and replaced with class understanding. What once appeared natural and unchangeable is revealed as historical and contingent. Workers begin to recognize that exploitation is not the result of individual failure, but of social relations that can be transformed through collective action. The ruling class fears organization because it undermines both economic control and ideological dominance. When workers organize, they challenge the narrative that society functions for the benefit of all. They expose the contradiction between democratic ideals and economic reality. Organization reveals that political rights without economic power are hollow, and that true freedom requires control over the conditions of life and labor. This awareness threatens the legitimacy of existing institutions and the authority of those who benefit from them. Collective organization is not limited to the workplace. It extends into communities, movements, and international solidarity. Capital operates globally, and exploitation crosses borders, making isolated struggles insufficient. Organization enables connections across industries, regions, and nations, transforming local resistance into a broader force capable of confronting global systems of power. Through solidarity, workers recognize that their interests align not with national elites, but with other workers facing similar conditions worldwide. Liberation through organization does not mean the substitution of one ruling elite for another, but the abolition of domination itself. Collective organization aims at a society where production is organized to meet human needs rather than generate profit, where labor is no longer alienated, and where social wealth is collectively owned and democratically controlled. Such a transformation requires not spontaneous revolt, but sustained, conscious organization capable of restructuring social relations from the ground up. Reforms achieved without organization are fragile and reversible. Rights granted from above can be withdrawn when conditions change. Collective organization secures gains by embedding them in social power rather than legal concession alone. It creates a culture of resistance and participation that persists beyond individual struggle, ensuring that progress is defended and extended rather than eroded over time. Collective organization also restores human dignity. It affirms that individuals are not powerless or disposable, but essential participants in shaping society. Through shared struggle, people rediscover solidarity, purpose, and agency. They cease to experience life as a series of private anxieties and begin to act as members of a collective capable of determining its own future. Liberation becomes not an abstract ideal but a lived process rooted in cooperation and mutual responsibility. Human liberation cannot be delivered by benevolent leaders or technological advancement alone. It requires the conscious self-emancipation of the oppressed through organization, struggle, and solidarity. As long as power remains concentrated and labor remains exploited, freedom will remain incomplete. Collective organization is the means through which humanity can overcome division, reclaim control over social life, and create conditions where freedom is not the privilege of a few but the shared reality of all, a process through which society moves from domination to cooperation and from necessity to conscious self-determination. The choice before us is no longer whether this system should change, but who will shape what comes after it. Capitalism has revealed its limits, its violence, and its inability to offer a future worthy of human potential. The old world persists only through habit, fear, and division, yet its foundations are weakening under the weight of its own contradictions. What comes next depends on whether the working class recognizes itself as the true maker of history. When workers unite across divisions, organize consciously, and act collectively, they do more than resist exploitation. They begin to construct a new social order rooted in equality, solidarity, and democratic control of life itself. The collapse of the old is inevitable, but the birth of the new requires struggle, clarity, and courage, for history does not move forward by hope alone, but by the organized force of those who refuse to remain subjects of domination, instead recognize themselves as the architects of a liberated human future.